The Battle of Delville Wood, a detailed account. Context and background. The Battle of Delville Wood took place during the Somme Offensive, one of the largest and most infamous battles of World War I. The offensive began on July 1, 1916, and stretched into November of that year, marking one of the bloodiest confrontations in military history. British and French forces sought to break through the German lines on the Western Front, aiming to relieve pressure on the French forces at Verdun and to weaken the German army's hold in the region. Delville Wood, located near Longueval, was seen as a critical point within this broader strategy. The wood was surrounded by a maze of trenches, and its dense foliage made it a prime target for both sides, as it offered cover for infantry and artillery. Whoever controlled Delville Wood would hold an important position that could either facilitate further Allied progress or provide the Germans with a vantage point to counterattack. The South African 1st Infantry Brigade, part of the larger British forces, was given the task of capturing and holding Delville Wood. Though relatively inexperienced compared to other British units, the South Africans were well trained and determined to prove themselves on the world stage. The South African Brigade's involvement. The 1st South African Infantry Brigade was composed of men from across South Africa, including soldiers from the Union of South Africa's various provinces. Though many of the soldiers were volunteers, they were assigned to serve with the British Army as part of the British Empire's war effort. These men fought under British command, and they had limited experience with the brutal and technologically advanced warfare on the Western Front. Under the leadership of General Sir Henry Seymour, the South African Brigade entered the fray in mid-July. The South African forces had to contend with a heavily fortified German defense, which included well-positioned artillery, machine guns, and highly organized defensive lines. On July 15, 1916, the South African Brigade moved toward Delville Wood with the intent to capture it and secure it for further British operations. This was the beginning of what would be an excruciating struggle. The battle unfolds, dense combat and heavy losses. The attack on Delville Wood began in earnest on the morning of July 15. As the South African Brigade advanced, the Germans met them with ferocious resistance, using their entrenched positions to devastating effect. The Allies were attempting a frontal assault in the face of overwhelming artillery and machine gun fire. From the outset, the battle was one-sided in terms of the terrain, as the Germans had the advantage of high ground and prepared positions. The dense foliage of Delville Wood, which initially offered some cover to the South African attackers, soon became a hindrance. The trees and undergrowth slowed movement and created a chaotic battlefield, where soldiers could only advance in small groups or in limited waves. The Germans counterattacked with brutal efficiency, using their own infantry and artillery to disrupt the South African advance. The South African Brigade's units were initially successful in pushing into the wood, but their efforts quickly became bogged down. The Germans unleashed their artillery in heavy, sustained barrages, firing both from fixed positions and from mobile field guns that could quickly shift locations. The shelling was relentless, and soldiers struggled to maintain their cohesion in the face of constant bombardment. The South African forces were also engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat with the Germans, who were not willing to give up Delville Wood without a fight. As soldiers attempted to advance, many were killed by sniper fire or taken out by artillery. The South Africans found themselves fighting to hold the wood as much as they were fighting to capture it. By July 17, 1916, the South Africans had largely captured the central portion of Delville Wood. However, they were under constant pressure from German counterattacks. The Germans struck back with artillery, launching attacks against the South African positions at all hours of the day and night. Despite being under siege, the South Africans fought on. They were reinforced by a small number of men, but their position became increasingly untenable. The conditions in the wood were appalling. Soldiers lived in trenches that were flooded by rainwater, their bodies caked with mud, and the smell of death hung heavy in the air. Food and ammunition were in short supply, and many soldiers were wounded, leaving only a handful of men to fight on. The strategic importance of the wood and the struggle to hold it. While the British High Command saw the capture of Delville Wood as essential to the success of the Somme Offensive, they underestimated the challenges that the South African Brigade would face. The importance of holding the wood lay in its strategic position along the German defences. If the wood could be secured, it would allow the British to push forward to other key objectives, but failure to hold it could expose the Allies to devastating counterattacks. Delville Wood's position made it a critical vantage point, offering a view of the surrounding battlefield. The South African forces, already stretched thin, were under attack from all directions. The Germans relentlessly pounded their positions, firing artillery shells and launching infantry assaults at regular intervals. During the battle, the South African brigade was often isolated from the rest of the British forces. Many units were cut off, and the men of the brigade faced incredibly high casualties. Communication lines were severed, and the brigade was forced to operate without reinforcements or support. The soldiers were frequently outnumbered, and for several days, they fought with little more than their rifles, bayonets, and the sheer determination to hold their ground. The final push and withdrawal. By August 19, 1916, the South African brigade had suffered devastating casualties. Supplies had dwindled, and many of the men were near exhaustion. The British High Command, recognizing the immense toll of the battle, ordered the South African forces to withdraw and consolidate their positions. At this point, the Germans had launched multiple counterattacks, and their strength was too overwhelming for the South Africans to withstand. After almost a month of brutal fighting, the South African brigade was relieved and pulled out of Delville Wood on August 20, 1916. Although they had managed to hold the wood for an extended period, the cost was staggering. Of the 3,153 soldiers from the South African brigade who had entered the battle, only 750 remained fit for further duty. The remainder had been killed, wounded, or incapacitated by the harsh conditions. Casualties and aftermath. The Battle of Delville Wood left a lasting scar on the South African brigade. Casualty figures are staggering: over 1,000 men were killed, and many others suffered from permanent injuries. The men who survived the battle were left physically and mentally scarred by the horrors they had experienced. The battle also contributed to the broader context of the Somme Offensive. Despite the horrific losses, the capture of Delville Wood provided the Allies with a foothold in the region, and it allowed them to continue their offensive. However, the fighting in Delville Wood demonstrated the brutal realities of trench warfare and the extreme challenges of conducting large-scale battles in densely forested or urban terrain. Legacy, commemoration and remembrance. The sacrifices made by the South African soldiers at Delville Wood were not forgotten. Today, Delville Wood is home to the Delville Wood Memorial, a monument dedicated to the bravery of the South African forces who fought and died there. The memorial, located at Longueval in northern France, features a large obelisk and plaques bearing the names of the fallen soldiers. The battle remains a defining moment in South Africa's military history. It symbolizes the courage and endurance of the South African soldiers who fought on foreign soil, far from their homeland, and whose sacrifices helped shape the nation's legacy in both World War I and the subsequent years.